Hello and welcome to Day 4 Notes. Today we are graphing in Vertex form and converting between standard form and Vertex form. First we have a warm-up. It says graph the quadratic equation in intercept form. So if you want to pause the video now and try that warm-up. Alright, here we go. So, a few things I wanted to point out about the warm-up. The first thing that I notice is that my A value is negative, which means don't forget that our graph is going to be open down. The second thing that I did was identify my P and my Q. My P is 2 and my Q is -3. From the notes on day 3, we can use the equation to find my axis of symmetry, which is P plus Q over 2. So I plugged in my P and Q value and found my axis of symmetry. Remember, we talked about when we find our axis of symmetry, we always want to write it as x equals -1/2. Mainly x equals because it is a line. And then from using that axis of symmetry, I was able to find my vertex, which is not at a pretty point. It's at -1/2 or -0.5 and 6.25. So that's not a complete pretty point, but since I found my AOS at the very beginning of my problem, that is what allowed me to go ahead and find my vertex. After that, I took my equation and I plugged it into my calculator under table to find the rest of the points to be able to graph my parabola. Alright, next we're going to talk about vertex form. So, we have this new equation, y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. And why do you think it's called vertex form? Well, there's two new things that's going to be introduced today, or two new variables that we have not seen before, and that's the h and the k. Those two values are the values that give us our vertex. So h comma k is our vertex. So if we go through these next few problems, we can determine what values our vertex is going to fall at, what point our vertex will fall at. So notice up here in our vertex form problem, we have x minus h plus k. So something that I want to point out is that we're going to use the opposite of h and the same value of k. Let me fix that real quick. So the opposite of h and the same value of k. So what I mean by opposite, we'll talk about that in this first problem. So we see that we have our h value here and our k value here. So if I use the opposite of my h value, it'll take that +3 and change it to a -3. And if I use the same value of my k, that will stay at -4. So we have my vertex here, which is at -3, -4. It also wants me to determine if the vertex is a maximum or a minimum. We can determine if our vertex is a maximum or minimum by determining which way our parabola is open. In this case, since our parabola or our equation has an a value that is negative, that means our parabola is open down. So it'll look something like this. My vertex will be up here. So since my vertex is at the top of the parabola, we'll call that a maximum. Alright. On to our next problem, g of x. So we'll first identify our h value and our k value from our equation, and then we'll find the vertex. Remember I said our vertex is going to be the opposite of h, so since h is -2, it's going to be positive 2. And then the same of k, which is positive 5. The next thing that I want to look at is my a value. My a value in this case is positive 3. Since my a value is positive, that means that our parabola is going to be open up with our vertex at the bottom. When the vertex is at the bottom, we call that a minimum. Next, we're going to talk about wx. We'll find our h and k. My h value is -6. My k value is -1. To find my vertex, we do the opposite of h. So my -6 turns into a positive 6, and the same of k, which is -1. Now I need to look at my a value again to determine if my graph is open up or open down. Here, I don't have an a value that's written. When I don't have a written a value, my a value is going to be 1. And since that 1 is a positive, we know that our graph is open up. When our graphs open up, our vertex is at the bottom, and we call that a minimum. Finally, on to j of x. We're going to identify h and k. So we have a positive 4 and a -3. Remember, when we find our vertex, we do the opposite of h and the same of k. The opposite of positive 4 is -4, and the same of k is positive 3. Now we'll identify our a value, which is negative. That means that our parabola is open down with our vertex at the top. When our vertex is at the top, we call that a maximum. So here's the final product of all of our finding the vertex and finding the max or min. Now we're going to move on to the next page to talk about graphing in vertex form. So since we're graphing in vertex form, the first thing that we can find, or the first thing that is apparent to us from our new equation, is our vertex. We're going to do the same thing that we did on the previous problem. We're going to find h and k and write our vertex. But remember, our vertex is the opposite of h, so my positive 1 will turn into a -1, and the same of k, which will give me positive 2. If you remember from our other notes, we have talked about where our axis of symmetry runs in comparison to our vertex. So I want you to remember that every time that we have an axis of symmetry or a vertex, our axis of symmetry is going to run through that same x value of our vertex. So our x value here is -1, so our axis of symmetry will actually run through -1. You don't have to do any additional steps after finding the vertex to find the axis of symmetry. Now we want to create a table for our parabola, which is here on our xy chart. And remember, our vertex is in the very center of our parabola. So what I like to do to make it a little bit easier for me is write out my vertex, -1, +2, right here in the middle of my table. And I'll do 2 numbers below my vertex and 2 numbers above my vertex so that I can have about 5 points to plot. So -2, -3, 0, and 1. Now we need to find all the points that goes, or all of our y values that go with our x values. So we'll open up our calculator and go to table. If you have something in there, go ahead and clear that out. And then we'll type in our equation. We have 2x plus 1 squared plus 2. And from looking at our xy chart, we know that we need to start at the x value of -3. We'll step by ones and okay. So -3, 10, -2, 4, -1, 2 is what we already found, 0, 4, and 1, 10. And there we go. Now we can plot our points. After plotting our points, our graph should look like this. All right, on to our next problem. First thing that we want to do here again is find our vertex. So, we find our h and our k. Remember, we do the opposite of h, which will give me +1, and the same of k, which will give me +3. And our axis of symmetry runs through the x value of our vertex, so our axis of symmetry will be x equals 1. Since I already found my vertex, I'm going to use the same strategy that I did on the previous problem, where I put my vertex in the middle of my xy chart, and then I do 2 numbers below it and 2 numbers above it so that I have 5 points to plot. And now we go to our calculator to find the rest of our values. So we click Table, and we do negative parentheses x minus 1 squared plus 3. Press Enter, and then we look at our table to see where we need to start, and the smallest x value here is -1. So we'll start at -1, step by ones, keep it on auto, and OK. So we have -1, -1, 0, 2, and 1, 3. We can keep scrolling to find the other 2 terms. We have 2, 2, and 3, -1. And now we want to go ahead and graph our points. And there you go. All right, one more graph to practice on. So now we want to find our vertex for this graph. I can find my h, which is right here, but I don't have a k value. And remember, since my k value is added or subtracted to my problem, if there's nothing there and we're adding or subtracting, my k value is going to be something like +0. So when there's nothing there and you're adding or subtracting, your value will be 0. So we have h and k. We want to go ahead and find my vertex. So the opposite of h will change that -2 to a +2, and the same of k will keep that at 0. My axis of symmetry again runs through my x value, which is x equals 2. And now I want to go ahead and create my xy table. You can go ahead and pause the video now, create your table, and graph your parabola. After completing the xy chart and graphing my parabola, your final answer should look something like this.